The wind moved through the broken windows like a breath that had been held too long, carrying with it the scent of dust and decades. The old hotel stood 3 stories tall against the flat Texas horizon, its red brick facade cracked and fading under the relentless sun. Route 47 had once been a main artery through this part of the state, back when travelers needed places to rest between the long stretches of nothing, back when this building had a name that people spoke with warmth instead of whispers. By the summer of 1988, the hotel had been abandoned for nearly 12 years. Its windows were dark eyes watching the occasional car pass by on the highway that no longer mattered, replaced by the interstate that cut through the land 15 miles to the north. The building had become a landmark of a different kind, one that locals pointed to with a mixture of curiosity and unease, one that teenagers dared each other to approach after dark, one that carried stories that grew more elaborate with each telling. Miriam Caldwell had heard those stories all her life. She had grown up in Kendrick Springs, the small town that sat 8 miles east of the hotel, a place where everyone knew everyone and the past was never quite past. At 23 years old, she worked as a reporter for the Kendrick Springs Gazette, a modest weekly newspaper that covered town council meetings, high school sports, and the occasional human interest story that reminded people why they chose to live in a place where the sky stretched forever and neighbors still waved from their porches. She had always been curious, the kind of child who asked too many questions and never quite accepted the answers that adults gave when they wanted to avoid the truth. Her grandmother used to say that Miriam had been born with a searchlight where most people had a nightlight, always looking for what was hidden, always pushing past the comfortable surface of things. The hotel had fascinated her since childhood. She remembered driving past it with her father, the way his hands would tighten on the steering wheel, the way his jaw would set in that particular way that meant a subject was closed before it had even opened. She remembered asking why it was empty, why no one bought it, why it just sat there like a scar on the landscape. Her father had told her that some places were better left alone, that not every question needed an answer, but Miriam had never been good at leaving things alone. The stories about the hotel had been circulating for as long as anyone could remember. People reported seeing lights in the windows late at night, flickering and faint, like candles carried by invisible hands. There were accounts of sounds, low and rhythmic, like footsteps on hollow floors, like doors closing in empty rooms. Some claimed to have seen shadows moving behind the broken glass, shapes that seemed almost human but never quite resolved into anything concrete. Most people dismissed these accounts as imagination, the product of suggestion and darkness, and the human tendency to find patterns where none existed. But the stories persisted, passed down through generations, accumulating details and variations, becoming part of the local folklore that defined the area as much as the land itself. Miriam had decided to investigate the hotel for a feature story. The Gazette needed something substantial for the summer edition, something that would capture readers beyond the usual fare. Her editor, a pragmatic man named Douglas Fenton who had run the paper for 30 years, had been skeptical at first. He told her that ghost stories were fine for campfires but not for serious journalism. But Miriam had a way of presenting her ideas that made them seem reasonable, necessary even, and eventually he had agreed to give her the space and the time to pursue the story properly. She began with the records, spending long afternoons in the county archives, pulling files that smelled of old paper and neglect. The hotel had been called the Riverside Inn, though there was no river anywhere nearby. It had been built in 1946 by a man named Lawrence Hester, a businessman from the eastern part of the state who had seen opportunity in the post-war boom, in the new highways that promised to connect the scattered towns and cities of Texas into something resembling a coherent whole. The hotel had done well for its first 2 decades. The records showed consistent business, Steady revenue, regular maintenance. Hester had run it until his death in 1968, at which point his daughter Constance had taken over. She had continued to operate the hotel until 1976, when abruptly, without warning or explanation documented in any official capacity, the Riverside Inn had closed its doors. Miriam found the closure itself peculiar. There was no bankruptcy filing, no sale of property, no legal dispute that would explain such a sudden end. The building simply stopped operating. Constance Hester had left Kendrick Springs shortly after, and according to the sparse records Miriam could find, she had moved to California and had not returned. The lack of information was more intriguing than any explanation would have been. Miriam had learned that silence often indicated something worth discovering, that the absence of a story was itself a kind of story, one that required patience and persistence to uncover. She began interviewing people who had lived in the area during the hotel's final years. This proved more difficult than she had anticipated. Many were reluctant to talk, offering vague statements about how they couldn't quite remember, how it had been such a long time, how they were probably mixing up their memories. But Miriam was patient, and she knew how to listen, how to wait for the moments when people forgot to be guarded. An elderly man named Porter Tinsdale finally gave her something substantial. He had been a state trooper in the 70s, patrolling the highways and back roads, responding to accidents and disturbances. He agreed to meet Miriam at a diner on the edge of town, a place with vinyl booths and coffee that tasted like it had been sitting on the burner too long. Porter was in his 70s now, with hands that trembled slightly as he held his cup. His eyes were still sharp, though, and when he talked about the past, his voice carried the careful precision of someone who had spent years writing reports and testifying in courtrooms. He told Miriam that the hotel had become a problem in its final years. There had been complaints from guests, strange complaints that didn't quite make sense. People reported hearing things at night, sounds that came from outside the building rather than inside it. Footsteps in the gravel parking lot when no one was there. Voices that seemed to come from the fields behind the hotel, low and indistinct, like conversations happening just beyond the range of understanding. The complaints had been sporadic at first, easy to dismiss as the typical oddities that came with running a roadside business, but they had increased in frequency and consistency. Guests began checking out in the middle of the night, leaving without explanation, sometimes without even settling their bills. The hotel's reputation suffered, and business declined sharply in the months before it closed. Porter remembered being called to the hotel several times during that period. He would arrive to find frightened guests, sometimes standing in the parking lot with their luggage, refusing to go back inside even to collect their belongings. They would describe the sounds, the sense of being watched, the feeling that something was happening just outside the reach of their perception. He had investigated, of course. He had walked the perimeter of the building, searched the fields, looked for evidence of trespassers or troublemakers. He never found anything concrete, no footprints that shouldn't be there, no signs of disturbance, no logical explanation for what people were experiencing. Constance Hester had called him one night in early spring of 1976. It was late, past midnight, and her voice on the phone had been strained in a way that Porter had recognized from years of taking emergency calls. She told him that she needed him to come to the hotel, that something was wrong, that she couldn't explain it properly but she needed help. When Porter arrived, he found Constance standing in the lobby, fully dressed despite the hour. The hotel was empty of guests. She told him that she had been hearing the sounds for weeks now, that they came every night, that they seemed to be getting closer to the building. She said that the previous night, she had looked out from her second-floor apartment and had seen something in the field behind the hotel. Porter asked her what she had seen. Constance had struggled to describe it. She said it looked like people, or shapes that suggested people, standing in a group about 50 yards from the building. They weren't moving, just standing there in the darkness. She had watched them for several minutes, and then they had simply disappeared, not walking away but vanishing, like they had never been there at all. Porter had taken his flashlight and walked out to the field. The night had been clear, the moon bright enough to see by. He had found nothing in the field, no indication that anyone had been standing there. The grass was undisturbed. The ground showed no signs of recent presence. He had returned to the hotel and told Constance that there was nothing out there. She had looked at him with an expression he still remembered decades later, a mixture of relief and resignation, and something else that might have been understanding. She told him that she believed him, that she knew he wouldn't find anything, because she was beginning to understand that whatever was happening wasn't something that could be found in the normal way. 2 weeks later, the hotel closed. Constance left town, and the building sat empty, slowly deteriorating, slowly becoming the source of legends rather than a functioning business. Porter told Miriam that he had driven past the hotel many times over the years, especially during his night shifts. He admitted that there had been occasions when he thought he saw lights in the windows, when he heard sounds that seemed to come from the property. But he had learned not to investigate, had learned that some mysteries didn't have solutions that made sense, that some things were better observed from a distance. Miriam left the diner with her notebook full of details and her mind full of questions. She drove out to the hotel that evening, parking her car on the shoulder of the old highway as the sun began to set. The building looked different in the fading light, less abandoned and more patient, as if it were waiting for something. She walked around the perimeter, careful of the broken glass and loose boards, documenting the structure with her camera. The field behind the hotel stretched out toward a line of trees in the distance. It was ordinary land, unremarkable, the kind of space that existed in countless places across the state. As darkness fell, Miriam stood in the parking lot and listened. The wind moved through the building, creating sounds that could almost be mistaken for something else. She heard the distant rumble of trucks on the interstate, the rustle of grass, the settling of old wood and brick. Nothing unusual, nothing that couldn't be explained. She was about to leave when she noticed something at the edge of the field. Not a light or a shadow, but a disruption in the darkness, a sense that the space wasn't quite as empty as it appeared. She stood very still, watching, waiting for her eyes to adjust further, waiting to see if the impression would resolve into something tangible. It didn't. The field remained dark and quiet, but the feeling persisted, the sense that something was there, just beyond her ability to perceive it clearly. She understood then why guests had left in the night, why Constance had closed the hotel, why the stories had continued for so many years. The mystery wasn't about what was inside the building. It had never been about the hotel itself. Whatever people had experienced, whatever had driven them away, it came from outside, from the land, from something that existed in the space between the hotel and the distant trees. Miriam returned to her car and drove back to Kendrick Springs, knowing that her investigation had only just begun, knowing that the real story lay not in the abandoned building, but in the field beyond it, knowing that some questions led not to answers, but to deeper, stranger questions that required a different kind of courage to pursue. The morning after her visit to the hotel, Miriam sat at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold while she reviewed her notes. The feeling from the night before had not diminished with daylight. If anything, the distance from the experience had made it more concrete, more real. She had felt something in that field, something that existed outside the comfortable boundaries of rational explanation. She needed to understand what had happened in that space, what continued to happen. The hotel was merely a witness, a structure that had the misfortune of being built too close to something it could not comprehend or control. Over the following weeks, Miriam expanded her investigation beyond the official records and interviews. She began searching for patterns, for other accounts that might shed light on the phenomenon. The county library had old newspapers on microfilm, and she spent hours scrolling through decades of local news, looking for anything that might connect to the hotel or the land it occupied. What she found was not a single dramatic event, but rather an accumulation of small oddities scattered across time. In 1952, there had been a brief article about livestock disturbances on a ranch adjacent to where the hotel would later stand. Cattle had been found in unusual formations, standing in perfect circles in the pre-dawn hours, unresponsive to their handlers for several minutes before returning to normal behavior. The rancher had attributed it to some kind of natural phenomenon, perhaps related to mineral deposits in the soil affecting animal navigation. In 1963, a family traveling cross-country had reported to local authorities that they had stopped near the hotel to rest and had experienced what they described as lost time. They had pulled over just after sunset, intending to stretch their legs for a few minutes, and when they returned to their vehicle, nearly 2 hours had passed, though it had felt like only moments. The report had been filed and forgotten, dismissed as confusion or fatigue from long-distance driving. In 1971, a utility worker servicing power lines in the area had called in sick for 3 consecutive days after working near the hotel property. When he finally returned to work, he had requested a transfer to a different service area. According to a brief mention in the employee newsletter Miriam found in a box of donated papers at the library, the worker had never provided a clear explanation for his request, only stating that he preferred not to work in that particular location anymore. These incidents were separated by years, documented in different ways, connected only by their proximity to the same stretch of land. Individually, they meant nothing. Together, they suggested something persistent, something that had been present long before the hotel was built, and would likely continue long after the building finally collapsed into rubble. Miriam tried to locate Constance Hester, the hotel's last owner. The trail led to Lowe's Angels, where Constance had lived for several years after leaving Texas. But the most recent address Miriam could find was over a decade old, and none of her attempts to reach Constance through phone directories or public records yielded results. It was as if the woman had deliberately erased herself, had chosen to disappear as thoroughly as the phenomena that had driven her away from her family's business. She had better luck finding former employees of the hotel. A woman named Dolores Pacheco had worked as a housekeeper at the Riverside Inn during its final 2 years of operation. She was in her 70s now, living in a modest house on the south side of Kendrick Springs with a garden full of roses and a porch swing that creaked in the breeze. Dolores invited Miriam inside and served her sweet tea in glasses that had once been jelly jars. She spoke with the careful consideration of someone who had spent years deciding whether to talk about certain things, who had weighed the cost of speaking against the relief of finally being heard. She told Miriam that working at the hotel had become increasingly difficult toward the end. The guests were often distressed, complaining about sleepless nights and unexplained sounds, but it was not the guests that had troubled Dolores most. It was the mornings when she would arrive to clean the rooms and find them in states that suggested something more than restless sleep. Furniture would be moved, not dramatically but noticeably, pushed away from the walls as if someone had been trying to see behind them or through them. Personal items would be arranged in patterns, lined up with geometric precision on dressers or nightstands, though the guests swore they had left them scattered randomly. Windows that had been closed and locked the night before would be found open, not just unlatched but fully opened, as if something had needed to let the outside in or the inside out. Dolores said that the staff had begun to notice changes in the building itself. Clocks would run strangely, some too fast and others too slow, though they were all wound correctly. The temperature in certain rooms would drop suddenly, not gradually as when a heater failed, but instantly, as if someone had opened a door to winter in the middle of summer. Mirrors would show strange reflections, not ghostly images or supernatural manifestations, but distortions, warping of space that made rooms look deeper or taller than they actually were. The most disturbing aspect, Dollars said, was the consistency. These occurrences followed patterns, happened at regular intervals, as if they were part of some schedule that had nothing to do with human activity. They intensified during specific times of the month, particularly around the new moon when the nights were darkest. They seemed to focus on the rooms that faced the back field, the ones with windows that looked out toward the tree line in the distance. Constance Hester had tried everything to address the situation. She had brought in electricians to check the wiring, plumbers to inspect for gas leaks that might cause hallucinations, contractors to examine the building's foundation for structural issues. She had even consulted with a professor from the state university, a man who studied atmospheric phenomena and unusual weather patterns. Nothing explained what was happening. The building was sound. The utilities functioned properly. There was no rational reason for the experiences people reported. In the final weeks before the hotel closed, Dollars recalled that Constance had stopped trying to find explanations. She had seemed to accept that whatever was happening existed beyond the reach of practical solutions. She became quiet, withdrawn, spending long hours sitting in the lobby or standing at the windows, watching the field behind the hotel with an expression that Dollars described as understanding mixed with resignation. On the last day the hotel was open, Constance had gathered the small staff together. She told them that she was closing the business, not because it was failing financially, but because she could no longer in good conscience ask people to stay in a place that caused them distress. She paid each employee a generous severance, more than was required, and thanked them for their loyalty. Then she locked the doors and left Kendrick Springs within the week. Dollars told Miriam that she had driven past the hotel countless times over the years. She admitted that there were nights when she could see lights in the windows, faint and flickering, and that sometimes she thought she saw figures standing in the field behind the building. But she had never stopped to investigate, had never shared these observations with anyone except her husband, who had passed away 5 years earlier. She said that some things were meant to remain mysterious, that not everything in the world needed to be explained or understood. Miriam left Dollars' house with a deeper sense of the phenomenon's nature. This was not a haunting in the traditional sense, not the remnant of past tragedies or restless spirits. This was something ongoing, something active, something that interacted with the physical world according to rules that humans had not yet discovered or acknowledged. She began researching similar phenomena in other locations. The university library in the nearest city had extensive collections on unexplained occurrences, and Miriam spent weekends there, reading accounts from around the world. She found patterns that matched what she had learned about the hotel. Locations where unusual experiences repeated consistently over long periods, places where time seemed to behave strangely, where animals reacted to invisible stimuli, where people reported sensations of being observed without seeing observers. The scientific literature was cautious, full of careful language and qualified statements, but the underlying message was clear. There were places on Earth where normal physical laws appeared to flex, where the boundary between what was possible and what was supposed to be impossible became permeable. These places were rare, difficult to study, and often dismissed by mainstream science as measurement errors or psychological phenomena. But the accumulation of data, the consistency of reports across cultures and centuries, suggested something more substantial. There were spaces where reality functioned differently, where something else existed alongside the familiar world, intersecting with it in ways that produced observable effects without clear causes. Miriam began drafting her article for the Gazette. She wrote carefully, balancing the mysterious elements with the factual investigation, presenting the historical record alongside the witness testimony. She avoided sensationalism, focusing instead on the human stories, the impact on people's lives, the questions that remained unanswered. Douglas Fenton read her draft with his typical skepticism, but as he turned the pages, his expression shifted from doubt to interest. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair and removed his reading glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose in the way he did when he was thinking seriously about something. He told Miriam that the story was good, better than good, but that publishing it would have consequences. The hotel was a known curiosity in the area, but putting these accounts in print would attract attention, might bring outsiders looking for thrills or explanations. He asked her if she was prepared for that, if she had considered what might happen when the story moved beyond the local community. Miriam said that she had considered it, that she believed the story deserved to be told properly rather than left to rumor and exaggeration. She argued that honest journalism meant documenting things that were difficult to explain as thoroughly as things that fit neatly into expected categories. Douglas agreed to publish the article. It ran as a special feature in the late summer edition of the Gazette, spread across 4 pages with Miriam's photographs of the hotel and historical images she had gathered from the county archives. The response was immediate and substantial. Letters poured into the newspaper office, more than the Gazette had received for any story in years. Some were from local residents sharing their own experiences with the hotel or the surrounding area, accounts they had kept private for decades. Others were from people outside Kendrick Springs who had heard about the article through friends or relatives, who recognized elements of Miriam's story in places they knew. A retired geology professor from the state university contacted Miriam directly. His name was Martin Reeves, and he had spent 40 years studying unusual electromagnetic phenomena in rural areas. He told her that the land around the old hotel sat on a geological formation that was relatively rare in Texas, a particular configuration of mineral deposits and underground water flows that could potentially create unusual electromagnetic fields. These fields, Reeves explained, were not strong enough to be dangerous, but were sufficient to affect sensitive equipment and possibly biological systems. Humans had electromagnetic signatures in their neural activity, and exposure to external fields could theoretically influence perception, emotion, and even time sense. Animals, with their different sensory ranges, might be more sensitive to these fields, explaining the livestock disturbances and the strange behavior of pets that some hotel guests had reported. Reeves proposed conducting a proper scientific survey of the area. He had access to equipment through the university, instruments that could measure electromagnetic variations, detect subsurface anomalies, and map the specific characteristics of the location. He believed that the phenomena Miriam had documented could be explained through natural processes that were simply not well understood yet. Miriam found this explanation both satisfying and insufficient. It offered a framework for understanding the physical aspects of what happened at the hotel, but it did not fully address the subjective experiences, the sense of presence that people reported, the feeling that something intelligent and aware existed in that space. The survey took place in late autumn. Reeves brought 2 graduate students and an array of equipment that looked both sophisticated and improvised. They spent 3 days mapping the area around the hotel, taking readings at different times of day and night, documenting variations in the electromagnetic field. The results were striking. The field behind the hotel showed significant anomalies, with electromagnetic fluctuations that were far stronger than background levels. These fluctuations followed patterns, increasing and decreasing in regular cycles that correlated with the lunar phases, strongest during the new moon when people had reported the most intense experiences. Reeves was excited by the findings. He wrote a preliminary paper based on the data and began planning more extensive research. But Miriam noticed something that the scientific instruments could not measure. During the nights when the team was conducting surveys, she watched the field from the hotel's parking lot and saw the same disturbance she had noticed on her first visit. Not lights or shadows, but a quality of the darkness, a sense that the space was occupied by something the equipment could detect only indirectly through its effects. The article and the subsequent research brought temporary attention to the hotel in Kendrick Springs. A few curiosity seekers visited, took photographs, posted about their trips on early internet forums. But the phenomenon itself remained elusive, difficult to experience on demand, unwilling to perform for audiences. By the following spring, the attention had faded. The hotel continued to stand empty, the field behind it remained undisturbed, and life in Kendrick Springs returned to its familiar rhythms. Martin Reeves published his findings in an obscure scientific journal where they were read by specialists, but gained little wider notice. The electromagnetic anomaly was documented, added to the geological record, but not pursued further due to limited funding and competing research priorities. Miriam moved on to other stories, though she never quite let go of the hotel investigation. She kept a file of notes and clippings, continued to collect accounts when people contacted her with new information. She drove past the hotel occasionally, always at night, always watching to see if the field showed signs of the presence she had felt. Years passed. Miriam's career developed. She eventually left the Gazette to work for a regional newspaper in a larger city, covering more substantial stories but never finding another that captivated her the way the hotel had. She married, had 2 children, built a life that was full and demanding. But the mystery remained with her, a question that lived in the back of her mind, surfacing during quiet moments when her thoughts had room to wander. Kendrick Springs changed slowly, the way small towns do. Businesses closed and opened, families moved away and new ones arrived, the population aged and renewed itself. The hotel remained, deteriorating further, becoming more dangerous as its structure weakened. The county put up fencing and warning signs, but these did little to stop occasional trespassers who wanted to explore the infamous abandoned building. Porter Tinsdale passed away in 2003. His obituary mentioned his decades of service as a state trooper, but made no reference to the hotel or the investigations he had conducted there. Dolores Pacheco died 2 years later, her funeral attended by dozens of people whose homes she had cleaned over the decades, whose lives she had touched with her quiet kindness and steady presence. Douglas Fenton retired from the Gazette in 2008, selling the paper to a media company that standardized its content and reduced its staff. The special character of the publication, its connection to local history and community memory, diminished though it continued to serve its basic function of reporting news. Miriam thought about the hotel less frequently as time went on, though it never entirely left her consciousness. She had come to accept that some mysteries resist solution, that documentation and understanding are not the same thing, that bearing witness is sometimes the only response available to phenomena that exist beyond explanation. In the spring of 2014, she received a phone call from a woman named Andrea Walsh. Walsh was a graduate student in anthropology at the State University, working on a thesis about how communities create and maintain folklore around unexplained phenomena. She had come across Miriam's article from 1988 and wanted to interview her about the investigation and its aftermath. They met at a coffee shop in the city where Miriam now lived, 2 hours from Kendrick Springs. Andrea was in her mid-20s, earnest and intelligent, reminding Miriam of herself at that age. They talked for over 2 hours, Miriam sharing details she had not thought about in years, remembering the texture of that investigation, the feeling of pursuing something that remained always just out of reach. Andrea told her that she had visited the hotel as part of her research. She had gone at night, following the same path Miriam had taken decades earlier. She had experienced the same sense of presence in the field, the same disturbance in the darkness that resisted definition. But she had also found something new. Behind the tree line at the far end of the field, Andrea had discovered evidence of human activity from a much earlier period. Stone arrangements that appeared deliberate, markers that might have been part of a boundary or ceremonial space. She had brought an archaeology professor to examine the site, and preliminary assessment suggested the stones had been placed sometime in the late 1800s, possibly by indigenous peoples who had lived in the area before European settlement. The arrangement created a kind of threshold, Andrea explained, a designated space that separated one area from another. Many cultures had traditions of marking places where the normal world intersected with something else, where boundaries were thin and crossing required acknowledgement or respect. The stones near the hotel might represent such a marker, an old recognition of what that land represented. This information recontextualized everything Miriam had learned 26 years earlier. The phenomena at the hotel were not new, not triggered by the building's construction or operation. They had existed for much longer, probably for centuries or millennia. The hotel had simply been built too close to a space that had been marked as significant or dangerous long before anyone kept written records. Andrea was planning to include this finding in her thesis, along with an analysis of how the hotel's story had evolved in local memory. She asked Miriam if she had any interest in returning to the investigation, perhaps collaborating on a more comprehensive documentation of the site and its history. Miriam considered the offer. She was in her early 50s now, her children nearly grown, her career stable but perhaps lacking the spark of discovery that had driven her younger self. The idea of returning to the mystery that had defined her early work appealed to something deep in her character, the part that had never quite stopped asking questions. Before she could answer, her phone rang. It was a number she did not recognize, a Texas area code. She excused herself and answered. The voice on the other end belonged to a county sheriff's deputy from Kendrick Springs. He apologized for tracking her down, but explained that her name had come up in connection with a discovery near the old hotel on Route 47. Some hikers had been exploring the area behind the building, had ventured into the tree line Andrea had mentioned, and had found something that required investigation. The deputy's voice was carefully neutral, the tone of someone trained to deliver difficult information without causing unnecessary alarm. He told Miriam that the hikers had discovered what appeared to be human remains, partially buried in the soil near the stone markers. The remains were old. Initial assessments suggested decades rather than years, but they required proper examination and identification. Given Miriam's previous investigation and documentation of the site, given her article that remained the most comprehensive account of the hotel's history, the authorities thought she might have information that could help contextualize the discovery. They wanted to know if her research had uncovered any reports of missing persons associated with the hotel, any disappearances that might connect to what had been found. Miriam felt something shift inside her, a realignment of understanding. The phenomena at the hotel, the electromagnetic anomalies, the sense of presence in the field, all of it might have been surrounding something far more concrete and tragic. Whatever had marked that space as significant might have been both natural phenomenon and human history, layers of meaning accumulated over time. She told the deputy that she would need to review her old files, but that she would contact him with any relevant information. She ended the call and turned back to Andrea, who was watching her with concern and curiosity. Miriam realized that the investigation she had begun in her 20s had not ended but merely paused, waiting for the right moment to resume. The hotel had kept its secret for decades. The land had held onto evidence that would finally allow understanding to move beyond speculation. She told Andrea that yes, she was interested in collaborating, that in fact it appeared they had no choice. The mystery was no longer just about unexplained phenomena, or folklore, or electromagnetic fields. It was about something that had happened in that space, something that involved real people and real consequences, something that had been hidden not by supernatural forces, but by time and earth, and the tendency of difficult truths to remain buried until someone cared enough to uncover them. The hotel still stood against the Texas horizon, its windows dark and watching. But now those windows looked not inward at empty rooms, but outward toward the field where answers were finally, after so many years of silence, beginning to emerge into light. The remains were identified within 3 weeks. Dental records and bone analysis confirmed what the investigation would gradually reveal through careful examination of old files and forgotten reports. The body belonged to a man named Samuel Cortez, who had been 34 years old when he disappeared in July of 1976, just weeks before the Riverside Inn closed its doors forever. Miriam returned to Kendrick Springs for the first time in years, driving down roads that had been resurfaced and widened, but still followed the same paths she remembered. The town had grown slightly, new developments on its edges, but the core remained recognizable. The hotel stood as it always had, though now it was surrounded by official vehicles and temporary barriers, transformed from local curiosity into active crime scene. She met with Detective Raymond Salazar, who had taken lead on the investigation. He was younger than she expected, probably in his late 30s, with the focused intensity of someone who took his work seriously, but had not yet let it harden him. They sat in a conference room at the county sheriff's office while he laid out what they had discovered. Samuel Cortez had been a truck driver, running regular routes through West Texas. He had stayed at the Riverside Inn periodically over several years, familiar enough with the place that staff recognized him, comfortable enough that he sometimes extended his stays when his schedule allowed. In early July of '76, he had checked into the hotel for what should have been a 2-night stop. He had never checked out. The missing person report had been filed by his sister in El Paso after he failed to arrive for a family gathering and stopped responding to messages. Local authorities had investigated but found little to work with. His truck had been located in a rest area 40 miles from the hotel, keys in the ignition, no signs of struggle or foul play. The assumption had been that he had left voluntarily, perhaps dealing with personal issues, perhaps starting over somewhere new. The case had gone cold within months. What the current investigation had revealed was more complex and more human than anyone had anticipated. Through interviews with former staff members and review of the hotel's fragmentary records, a picture emerged of Samuel's final days. He had been troubled during that last visit, according to the housekeeper Dolores Pacheco's detailed memory when investigators spoke with her family after her passing. He had talked about hearing things at night, about feeling watched, about the strange quality of the field behind the hotel. But he had also been fascinated rather than frightened. He had asked questions about the land, about its history, about whether anyone had ever investigated what caused the phenomena. He had spent time walking the field, photographing the area, taking notes in a journal that was never recovered. He had seemed compelled by something, drawn to understand rather than to flee. The archaeological examination of the site where his remains were found had uncovered other evidence. The stone markers that Andrea Walsh had discovered predated Samuel's death by at least a century, but near them investigators found items from the 1970s, a belt buckle, corroded coins, fragments of fabric. And buried deeper, protected in a waterproof container, they found Samuel's journal. Miriam was allowed to read it, sitting in the evidence room with Detective Salazar present, turning pages that had been preserved by accident, by the careful way Samuel had tried to protect his observations. The entries spanned 3 days, written in neat handwriting that grew progressively more hurried and excited. Samuel had been documenting the phenomena at the hotel with the thoroughness of someone conducting serious research. He described the sounds in technical terms, noting their timing and duration. He sketched diagrams of the field, marking locations where he felt the presence most strongly. He recorded electromagnetic readings using equipment he had brought with him, crude measurements by modern standards but systematic and careful. His final entries revealed what had drawn him to the tree line, to the space where his life would end. He had noticed that the phenomena followed patterns that suggested intelligence, responses that seemed to anticipate observation. He theorized that something was trying to communicate, that the electromagnetic anomalies were not random but structured, potentially meaningful. He wrote that he intended to spend a night in the field, at the exact location where the effects were strongest, to see if sustained presence would allow for clearer interaction. The journal ended there. Whatever Samuel had experienced in that field, whatever had happened during his vigil, remained unrecorded. Medical examination could not determine exact cause of death due to the decomposition and time elapsed, but there was no evidence of violence or trauma. The most likely explanation was medical emergency, perhaps triggered by the stress of the experience or by environmental factors no one fully understood. But the question remained, the one that Miriam had been carrying since her first investigation. Why had Samuel's disappearance not led authorities to search the hotel more thoroughly? Why had no one connected his missing person case to the location where he was last seen? The answer revealed itself through deeper examination of the records from '76. Multiple reports and files from that period showed inconsistencies, documents misfiled or incomplete, communication breakdowns between agencies. But more significantly, there was evidence of deliberate misdirection. Someone had provided information suggesting that Samuel had been seen leaving the area, heading east toward Louisiana. That information had been false, but it had been specific enough and credible enough to redirect the investigation away from Kendrick Springs. Detective Salazar asked Miriam if her previous research had uncovered any indication of who might have wanted to obscure Samuel's presence at the hotel. She reviewed her old notes, contacted people she had interviewed decades ago, tried to reconstruct the circumstances of the hotel's final weeks. What emerged was not a conspiracy, but a tragedy compounded by fear and misunderstanding. Constance Hester had known that Samuel was missing. She had been the last person to see him when he told her he was going out to the field. When he did not return, when his room remained empty and his belongings sat untouched, she had faced an impossible choice. The hotel was already failing, already the subject of rumors and declining reputation. Reporting that a guest had vanished would have been the final catastrophe, would have brought investigation and attention that would destroy what remained of her family's business. More than that, Constance had believed, based on her own experiences in that field, that Samuel had not been murdered or harmed by human agency. She had thought he had encountered something beyond ordinary danger, something that authorities would not understand or take seriously. So she had made the devastating decision to hide his disappearance. She had removed his belongings from the hotel, disposed of them in ways that could not be traced. She had provided the false information about him being seen leaving the area, using contacts she had in the trucking community who passed along the story without questioning it. She had let investigators believe he had left voluntarily while she carried the weight of knowing where he had actually gone. Then she had closed the hotel, left Texas, and spent the rest of her life trying to outrun what she had done. It took weeks of investigation, but Salazar's team eventually located Constance Hester. She was living in Oregon under a married name, had been there for over 20 years. She was 78 years old, in failing health, residing in an assisted living facility that overlooked a river. When approached by investigators, she did not deny anything. She appeared, according to Salazar's report, almost relieved. Miriam requested permission to speak with Constance. It took coordination between states, legal consultations about witness access, but eventually arrangements were made. Miriam flew to Oregon on a cold morning in early spring, watching the landscape transform from Texas plains to mountain forests, feeling like she was traveling not just through space but through time, closing a circle that had been left open for nearly 40 years. The facility where Constance lived was comfortable and well-maintained, rooms that looked out on gardens and walking paths. Constance received Miriam in a common area, sitting in a chair by a window, wrapped in a cardigan despite the warmth of the room. Her face showed the accumulated weight of decades, but her eyes were still alert, still carrying the sharpness that came from years of running a business and making difficult decisions. They talked for hours. Constance spoke with the careful precision of someone who had rehearsed a confession in her mind countless times, who had been waiting for the chance to finally unburden herself. She confirmed what investigators had concluded, filled in details that only she knew, explained the reasoning that had seemed sound in the moment but had haunted her ever since. She told Miriam about the night Samuel did not return, how she had waited until dawn before going to look for him in the field. She had searched but had not found his body, had not ventured as far as the tree line where he had actually been. She had seen signs of disturbance in the grass, had felt the presence that she had come to recognize from years of living adjacent to that space, and had made the terrible assumption that Samuel had somehow crossed into whatever existed beyond the boundary of normal experience. Constance had not intended cruelty or callousness. She had been operating in a framework shaped by the unexplainable phenomena she had witnessed, by a worldview that had expanded to accommodate realities that official authorities did not acknowledge. She had believed she was protecting Samuel's family from knowledge they could not comprehend, that she was preventing investigation into matters that transcended ordinary crime or explanation. But in protecting her business and avoiding confrontation with the impossible, she had denied Samuel's family closure. She had left them with decades of uncertainty, with the pain of not knowing what had happened to someone they loved. That realization had broken something in Constance, had driven her from Texas and shadowed every year of her subsequent life. She asked Miriam if there was any possibility of forgiveness, if Samuel's family might understand the context of her choices, even if they could not accept them. Miriam could not answer that question. It belonged to people she had never met, to a family that was about to receive both resolution and renewed grief. The legal aspects of the case were complex. The prosecutor in Texas had to determine whether charges could be filed for actions taken decades earlier, whether obstruction of justice and improper disposal of evidence could be proven beyond reasonable doubt, whether Constance's age and health made prosecution practical or just. These deliberations took months, involved consultations with legal scholars and ethicists, considered both justice and mercy. In the end, the decision was made not to pursue criminal charges. The evidence was old, much of it circumstantial, and Constance's cooperation with the current investigation weighed heavily in her favor. More significantly, Samuel's family, when consulted, requested that the focus remain on understanding what had happened rather than on punishment for its concealment. Samuel's sister Maria, who had filed the original missing person report and had lived with uncertainty for 38 years, agreed to speak with Miriam. They met in El Paso, in Maria's home where photographs of Samuel covered entire walls, frozen images of a man in his prime, smiling in various settings, remembered by family that had never stopped hoping. Maria was in her 70s, her hair white but her bearing strong. She served coffee and pan dulce, traditional courtesies that preceded difficult conversations. She told Miriam that knowing what happened to Samuel brought both relief and renewed sorrow. The relief came from certainty, from finally being able to properly mourn and memorialize. The sorrow came from understanding that he had died alone in pursuit of answers to questions that perhaps should not have been asked. But Maria did not blame Constance entirely. She understood, in the way that comes from living long enough to see the complexity of human motivation, that fear and misunderstanding could lead good people to make terrible choices. She said that Samuel had always been curious, always pushing boundaries, and that some part of her had always known he would find his way into territory that was dangerous precisely because it was unknown. What Maria wanted now was for Samuel to be properly buried, returned to family ground, remembered not as a mystery or a cautionary tale, but as a person who had lived with integrity and died in pursuit of understanding. She wanted his journal, which investigators agreed to release once it was no longer needed as evidence, so that she could see his final thoughts in his own handwriting, could hold something he had held, could close the distance that death and time had created. Miriam attended Samuel's funeral when his remains were finally released and laid to rest. It was a small ceremony, family and close friends, held in a cemetery where generations of the Cortez family were buried. Maria read from Samuel's journal, passages that showed his curiosity and systematic thinking, his respect for the mystery he had pursued. A priest offered prayers that acknowledged both the known and unknown aspects of existence, that made space for wonder within the framework of faith. Standing among the mourners, Miriam thought about all the ways a single story could ripple through time, affecting lives that never directly intersected. Samuel's death had led to the hotel's closure, which had led to decades of local legend, which had led to her investigation, which had trained her to ask certain kinds of questions, which had shaped her career and her understanding of how truth could hide in plain sight. And now his rediscovery was bringing resolution not just to his family but to everyone who had been touched by the hotel's mystery. After the funeral, Maria gave Miriam a photograph of Samuel. It showed him leaning against his truck, young and confident, the Texas sky huge behind him. Maria said she wanted Miriam to have it, to remember that behind every mystery there was a person, that journalism at its best honored the humanity it documented rather than just collecting facts. Andrea Walsh completed her thesis, incorporating the new findings into her analysis of how communities process unexplained phenomena. Her work argued that folklore and legend often contained kernels of truth that were obscured by the limitations of available explanations, that stories labeled as supernatural or imaginary sometimes pointed toward real events that simply could not be understood within conventional frameworks. The thesis was well received, led to publications, and eventually to a teaching position, where she continued to explore the intersection of anthropology and unexplained experience. Martin Reeves, the geology professor who had documented the electromagnetic anomalies, returned to the hotel site with updated equipment. The phenomena were still present, still following their patterns, still resistant to complete explanation. But the discovery of the stone markers and the indigenous connection led to new theories about how natural electromagnetic fields might have been recognized and marked by people who lacked scientific instruments, but possessed acute sensitivity to environmental variations. His research continued, adding slowly to human understanding of how the Earth itself could create experiences that felt otherworldly. Detective Salazar closed the case with a comprehensive report that would serve as a template for other investigations involving long-missing persons. He had learned, he told Miriam in their final conversation, that solving old cases required not just forensic skill but historical understanding, recognition that context and culture shaped how events were perceived and reported. The hotel investigation had taught him to look beyond the immediate evidence, to consider factors that official reports often missed or dismissed. Kendrick Springs absorbed the revelations as small towns do, incorporating the true story into its collective memory, while the legend gradually faded. The hotel remained standing for another year before the county finally demolished it, the structure too compromised to salvage safely. A historical marker was placed on the site, explaining the building's history and Samuel Cortez's story, acknowledging the mystery without sensationalizing it. The field behind where the hotel had stood was left undisturbed. The stone markers were documented and protected, recognized as archaeological resources. The electromagnetic anomalies continued, monitored occasionally by researchers but mostly left to exist as they always had, a natural phenomenon that would perhaps someday be fully understood or perhaps would remain one of the Earth's inexplicable variations. Miriam wrote the final chapter of the hotel story for a regional magazine, a long-form piece that connected all the threads she had been following for over 30 years. She wrote about Samuel and Constance, about the indigenous peoples who had marked that land as significant, about the ways human experience could exceed the boundaries of easy explanation. She wrote about how truth could be both found and elusive, how understanding required patience and humility, how the most important revelations were often the ones that restored dignity to the forgotten. The article won awards, was anthologized in collections about investigative journalism and true crime reporting, but more importantly to Miriam, it brought peace to people who had needed it. Maria Cortez sent her a letter thanking her for honoring Samuel's memory, for showing that his death, while tragic, had meaning in the pursuit of understanding. Former hotel employees contacted her to say they felt validated, that their experiences had been taken seriously rather than dismissed as imagination. Constance Hester died 18 months after Samuel's remains were found. Her obituary, which ran in the Kendrick Springs Gazette, acknowledged her role in the hotel's history without judgment, presenting her as a complex person who had faced impossible circumstances and made choices that haunted her. Maria Cortez sent flowers to the funeral, a gesture of forgiveness that Constance's children said would have meant everything to their mother. Years continued to pass. The hotel's story became history rather than mystery, taught in local schools as part of regional heritage, referenced in academic papers about geology and anthropology and investigative journalism. The phenomena in the field persisted, occasionally noticed by people who walked that land, but they no longer frightened because they were no longer completely unknown. Miriam retired from journalism eventually, though she never entirely stopped writing. She returned to Kendrick Springs periodically, visiting the site where the hotel had been, walking the field that had been the source of so much mystery and tragedy. The presence she had felt on her first visit was still there, that sense of something existing just beyond clear perception, but she had made her peace with it. She understood now that not everything could be explained, that some aspects of reality would always exceed human comprehension, but that this did not diminish the importance of asking questions and seeking truth. The hotel's story had taught her that investigation was valuable even when it led to partial answers, that documentation mattered even when certainty remained elusive, that honoring the human element was more important than solving every puzzle. On her last visit to the site, she stood where the hotel's back entrance had been and looked out across the field toward the tree line. The sun was setting, painting the Texas sky in shades of orange and purple. The wind moved through the grass with a sound like breathing, and somewhere in the distance a bird called its evening song. She thought about Samuel Cortez walking this same field 38 years earlier, notebook in hand, pursuing understanding with courage and curiosity. She thought about Constance Hester watching from the hotel windows, trapped between business obligations and inexplicable reality. She thought about all the guests who had felt afraid here, and all the people who had told their stories, and all the ways that human experience was richer and stranger than any single framework could contain. The field had kept its secrets for a long time, but patience and persistence had brought light to what had been hidden. Justice had been imperfect, as it often was, but truth had been served. Samuel's family had found peace, Constance had received a measure of forgiveness, and the community had transformed legend into history. As darkness gathered, Miriam noticed the familiar disturbance in the space near the tree line, that quality of the night that suggested presence without form. She did not approach it, did not try to capture it or explain it. Instead she acknowledged it, a nod to the mystery that remained and always would, then turned and walked back to her car. Behind her, the field lay quiet under emerging stars. The land held its electromagnetic signature, the stones marked their ancient boundary, and somewhere in the soil lived the memory of all who had passed through this space seeking answers. The hotel was gone, but its story remained, a testament to curiosity and consequence, to the ways that truth could hide and yet eventually emerge, to the possibility that understanding came not from explaining everything, but from respecting what lay beyond explanation. Miriam drove away as night settled fully over that stretch of Texas, carrying with her the knowledge that some investigations never truly ended but transformed into wisdom, that the questions we asked mattered as much as the answers we found, and that bearing witness to mystery was itself a form of courage worth honoring.